The morning light crept through the lace curtains of Willa Harper's small home like an old friend, soft, predictable, and patient. At 72, Willa's days moved slowly but deliberately. She prepared tea with ritual precision using the same chipped mug her late husband had once favored. On the kitchen table, a single saucer sat waiting not for a person but for Midnight, her sleek black cat with eyes like melted gold. Willa spoke to him every day. Not just idle chatter, but full conversations about the birds outside, about how her hip ached worse when it rained, about her dreams where her husband visited her in the garden. Midnight would listen sometimes, placing a paw gently on her lap, sometimes meowing as if answering. In the quiet house, his presence was more than company. It was tether and rhythm, the only thread tying her to her own mind. To anyone else, it might have looked odd, an elderly woman talking to a cat like it was a person. But to Willa, those moments were survival. Then came the knock. 3 short raps, not police, not neighbors. She opened the door to a young social worker with thin-rimmed glasses and a clipboard pressed tightly to her chest. "Mrs. Harper, we've received some reports. Neighbors are concerned. May we come in?" Within the hour, Willa was served papers, preliminary notice of involuntary psychiatric evaluation. Words like delusional and unresponsive to reality floated before her like smoke. Midnight hissed softly in the hallway. Something bad was about to happen. Willa Harper hadn't always lived alone in a creaking house filled with silence and feline whispers. Decades ago, she was a Navy wife, strong-poised endlessly, waiting for the return of her husband Aaron. When the telegram arrived during the Gulf War, her hands shook so badly she dropped her coffee mug. The message was short, final, killed in action. No children, no remains. Just a folded flag and unbearable quiet. Grief turned her insides hollow. At first, she busied herself with church events and baking pies for the neighbors, but as years passed, the invites stopped. Faces changed. Names faded. Only time stayed an uninvited guest stretching its legs across her life. She tried therapy, but therapists came and went. Medications dulled her thoughts. The loneliness deepened into something darker until the day she found Midnight, a shivering kitten behind a dumpster fur matted left for dead. She took him in. Over months, he began responding to her voice. He'd press himself against her chest on nights when she couldn't stop crying. And slowly the weight of solitude began to shift. With him, she found a reason to wake up, to move, to live. So when the social worker called her unfit, when they used her grief and coping as evidence of madness, something ancient stirred inside her. Not rage, not defiance. Duty. Aaron had once told her, "If you don't stand for yourself, they'll write your story without asking you a damn thing." Willa took a deep breath. She would not let them take her home, or Midnight. She would go to court. She would speak. She had nothing left to lose and a cat that had saved her life. The courthouse smelled like floor polish and paperwork, stale and sterile. Willa sat stiffly on the long wooden bench. Midnight curled tightly in his carrier at her feet as if he sensed something was wrong. Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles pale. Every so often she glanced down at the black mesh of the carrier, murmuring softly, "We're okay, baby. Just a misunderstanding. We're going to make this right." The hearing had been expedited emergency psychiatric evaluation, they said. The state social worker had filed a petition to have her involuntarily committed, claiming she was mentally unstable, unable to care for herself, and prone to bizarre emotional outbursts. The official write-up referred to her fixation on a cat as a conversational partner and cited concern from the community. Willa had never heard a single neighbor ask her how she was doing, but suddenly they were concerned. Her court-appointed attorney, a distracted young woman named Eva, barely looked up from her notes. "They're probably going to push for a 72-hour hold," she said. "You've got a chance to argue your case, but the court usually sides with the petitioner on first hearings, especially if there's no family to take responsibility." Willa's mouth tightened. "I don't need anyone to take responsibility. I pay my bills, I cook my meals, I walk to the market, and I talk to my cat, sure. But I'm not insane." Eva gave a polite but tired smile. "That's what we're here to prove, Mrs. Harper." The bailiff called her case number. Willa stood, legs aching back, straightened by memory. She walked into the courtroom like it was a battlefield. Midnight stayed in the carrier, his yellow eyes alert beneath the mesh. No one asked if she wanted him with her. She brought him anyway. The courtroom was small, no jury. Just the judge, the social worker, the court clerk, and a handful of observers. At the front, Judge Raymond Colton adjusted his glasses and peered down at Willa with cool indifference. He looked at her like a problem that needed solving. The social worker, Daria Kendall, was already speaking. She stood confidently at the podium, flipping through papers like a doctor reading a diagnosis. Your Honor, our department has received multiple reports of erratic behavior from Mrs. Harper. She is isolated, speaks to animals, as if they are human exhibits, signs of paranoia, and appears to lack the necessary support systems for independent living. We believe she poses a potential danger to herself due to cognitive decline and should be evaluated in a psychiatric facility. Willa opened her mouth, but the judge held up a hand. You'll have time to speak, Mrs. Harper. Daria continued. She has no family, no outside caregivers. If something were to happen to her, if she were to suffer a stroke or have a psychotic break, there is no one to intervene. She's lived alone for years, Eva interjected. There's no documented incident. She has a consistent routine and shows no violent tendencies or neglect. She speaks to a cat, Daria said firmly. That is not normal behavior for someone her age. Willa stood abruptly, anger finally cracking through her silence. That cat is why I didn't go to a psychiatric hospital 20 years ago. The courtroom went silent. Her voice, old but resolute, hung in the air. Judge Colton blinked, then gestured for her to continue. You have the floor, Mrs. Harper. Willa looked directly at him, trembling but fierce. My husband died in the Gulf War. I was 42. We had no kids. I got through that silence by holding on to anything that still breathed near me. Years passed and people left, but midnight? He stayed. He's not just a cat. He knows when I'm in pain. He lays on my chest when I'm struggling to breathe. He wakes me up when I forget to take my medication. He doesn't just listen. He protects me. There was no shaking in her voice now, only truth. Talking to him isn't delusion. It's therapy. It's love. If that's madness, then maybe we've all been crazy since the moment we started calling loneliness a symptom instead of a condition. Ava looked at her, then not with the clinical sympathy of someone assigned a case, but with the full gravity of human understanding. Judge Colton scribbled something. Daria stepped forward again. Mrs. Harper may seem coherent now, but many psychiatric patients are lucid under scrutiny. The concern is not one day of clarity, it's the unpredictability, the deterioration. She's not deteriorating, Ava said. She's grieving, and she's found a way to heal. Willa's eyes met Daria's cold stare. You've never lived alone a day in your life, have you? The judge cleared his throat. Enough. We'll reconvene this afternoon for psychiatric testimony. Until then, Mrs. Harper, you will be escorted for a preliminary mental health screening. A bailiff moved toward her. Willa bent down gently, lifting Midnight's carrier. Do not touch him, she said quietly. No pets allowed in the screening facility, the bailiff said flatly. He's not a pet, she whispered. He's what's keeping me alive. The courtroom door shut behind her and the quiet thud echoed like a gunshot. She was now inside the system where loneliness was insanity and love had to be defended like a crime. The evaluation room was barely the size of a utility closet. No windows. A table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs, 1 plastic, 1 metal. Willa sat in the plastic one, her back stiff, her jaw clenched. They'd taken Midnight. The bailiff had apologized vaguely, said something about protocol. A shelter worker from the county had come to retrieve him with a portable cage and a clipboard. Willa had begged to keep him by her side, but rules were rules and the system didn't bend for sentiment. I'll sue, she had whispered as they pried the carrier from her fingers. You're going to regret this. But she'd never felt so powerless, not even at Aaron's funeral. Now, sitting in the hard chair, her palms sweating, Willa was told to wait for the state-appointed psychiatrist. She could hear voices behind the door. 2 women laughing about lunch orders, the scratch of pens on clipboards. Just beyond that door, life was normal. But here inside, Willa felt like a ghost being prepared for judgment. She'd asked to call Eva, but they told her the attorney would be informed later. Everything had the same tone, mildly polite, maddeningly vague. She no longer felt like a person with rights. She felt like a case file. Dr. Neiman, the psychiatrist, finally entered, young, smiling, too rehearsed. Mrs. Harper, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. Please try to be honest. This is a safe space. Willa raised an eyebrow. Safe for who? He didn't laugh. He clicked his pen and began. The questions were subtle at first, memory recall orientation to time and space emotional self-assessment, but then they turned sharp. Do you believe your cat speaks to you in a human voice? No. Willa answered, eyes narrowing. But I believe he understands me better than most people. Do you hear voices other people don't? Only when the radio's broken. He smiled at that scribbled something, then tilted his head. Have you considered that your attachment to your cat might be a coping mechanism rooted in unresolved trauma? Willa leaned forward. Yes, and what of it? You all act like that's a disease, but some of us live with what we've lost. We carry it in whatever way we can. He said nothing, wrote more. When the exam ended, they didn't immediately let her go. 2 orderlies stood outside the room. One spoke into a radio. The other leaned against the wall like a bouncer outside a bar. Willa felt her body betray her hands, a trembling pulse, fluttering. This wasn't care. This was containment. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, she was released to the lobby, back into the echo of the courthouse, where Ava waited, face flushed with frustration. I didn't authorize a detainment. They said you weren't answering your phone. I was in court, Ava snapped. Jesus. She turned to Willa. They're going to use this against you. They'll say your responses were evasive, that you're angry, paranoid. Wouldn't you be? Willa's voice cracked. They stole my cat. Ava's eyes softened. We'll get him back. I've requested an emergency release order. But the hits kept coming. By evening, the local paper had picked up the story. The headline read, Elderly woman faces psychiatric review after disturbing behavior, cat confiscated. They used an old photo from her voter registration, a close-up, where her eyes looked distant and wild under the harsh DMV lighting. The article included selective quotes from the petition portraying her as unstable, isolated, and dangerous. Willa's phone began ringing with blocked numbers. She shut it off. At the grocery store the next morning, someone whispered as she walked by, That's the cat lady they're locking up. The loneliness she thought she'd mastered came roaring back, not as silence this time, but as ridicule. People she'd once smiled at turned away. Someone left a note in her mailbox. Get help before you hurt that animal. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat at her kitchen table and stared at the empty saucer beside her tea. Her hands trembled. Then came the knock. Not polite this time. Urgent. Repeated. Willa opened the door to find the shelter worker again, panicked, red-faced, papers in his hand. There's been a problem, he said. What problem? She asked slowly. He stepped in without waiting for permission. The cat Midnight, he escaped. Willa's blood ran cold. What do you mean escaped? We had him in the overnight pen. Somehow he got out. We've searched the grounds, filed a report, but you lost him. I'm sorry. She shoved past him, running down the porch steps, eyes sweeping the street. Midnight, she cried. Her voice broke on the second call. Midnight. There was nothing but wind. Her knees buckled on the sidewalk, the weight of everything crushing down. They'd taken her credibility, her dignity, and now her only companion, her lifeline. That night, she didn't sleep. The house was unbearably quiet. She walked from window to window, whispering his name, checking the bushes, hoping to hear his familiar paw steps on the wooden floor. No one came. The next day, Eva called. Her voice was low, serious. There's something else, she said. I overheard the social worker talking to someone outside court. She's trying to fast-track the commitment. If she succeeds, you could be placed in a long-term care facility. Permanently. Willa didn't answer. Eva continued, her voice firm. You need to fight harder, Willa. This isn't just about keeping your cat. This is about whether you get to live your life or not. Willa looked at the photo on the mantel, Aaron in uniform, arm around her shoulder, then at the empty saucer on the table. A single thought crossed her mind, slow and sharp. They're going to erase me. And in that moment, something inside her snapped back into place, not rage this time, but resolve. She stood up. Call whoever you need. Get the press. Get someone who gives a damn. Why? Because Willa said, voice steady, they messed with the wrong old woman. And they took the wrong damn cat. 2 days after Midnight's disappearance, Eva returned to Willa's home with heavy steps and grim news in her eyes. They're pushing for an emergency commitment hearing in 48 hours, she said. No delay, no appeal window. Willa didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the tea kettle as it hissed on the stove. Her movements were slower now. She hadn't eaten much since the shelter admitted they lost Midnight. Her home felt gutted quiet, not from peace, but from something gone terribly wrong. The judge will be the same one, Colton, Eva continued. They're using your reaction to the cat's loss as evidence of mental fragility. Willa turned. You mean I cried over my companion being stolen by the system, and now the system is calling me unstable for caring? Ava nodded silently. They want to use this as a precedent. If they succeed, other elderly people living alone might be targeted for similar interventions, especially if they're on state aid or don't have family. Willa's mouth hardened. So I'm a test subject. Ava hesitated. A case that opens a door for the wrong people. That night, Willa stayed up again, lights off, curtains open. Her body ached with something she couldn't name anymore. It wasn't grief. It wasn't rage. It was erasure being written out of her own life by people who'd never even sat in her living room or heard her laugh. At 2:11 a.m., she heard the scratching. Faint, quick, sharp against the back door. Her breath caught. She rushed to the door, flinging it open. There, covered in dirt, one ear torn slightly, stood Midnight. His eyes, wild gold and unblinking, locked onto hers. "Baby?" She gasped, tears spilling as she dropped to her knees. "You came back." He stepped into her arms like he'd never left. She held him close, rocking him gently, and as she cried into his fur, Midnight purred louder than she'd ever heard. He had clawed his way home. But it was only the beginning of the real fight. The next morning, Ava arrived to find Willa holding Midnight close to her chest. The cat was thinner but alive and alert. The moment Ava saw them together, something shifted in her expression. "I think we can use this," she whispered. They called Dr. Miriam Shaw, a therapist Willa had seen voluntarily after Aaron's death years before. Dr. Shaw had done pro bono work with trauma survivors, particularly veterans' spouses. She remembered Willa clearly and had kept her notes. She also had something even more valuable, a video recording from a private therapy session 5 years ago. Willa had consented to the recording at the time to help Dr. Shaw with a paper on non-verbal grief management. In the footage, Willa had been seated on a couch, visibly pale, withdrawn. Midnight sat curled on her lap. Her speech was barely audible, but then, as the session progressed, the cat placed both paws on Willa's chest and remained there for the duration of the conversation, calming her breathing, steadying her focus. Dr. Shaw agreed to testify in court and brought along medical documentation from a cardiologist who had monitored Willa's blood pressure and heart arrhythmia around the same time. The records showed a correlation between her respiratory episodes and the times Midnight had alerted her, meowing and pawing until she sought help. "This cat isn't a pet," Dr. Shaw said. "He's a support system, and possibly a diagnostic miracle." Willa barely slept the night before the hearing. She sat on the couch with Midnight on her lap, watching old VHS tapes of Aaron. His voice, his laugh, it felt like a memory someone else had lived. But then she'd look down at Midnight and remember she was still here, still fighting, still alive. The courtroom was packed. The press had arrived, tipped off by Eva's media contact. Local reporters, a few camera crews, and even a podcast journalist sat quietly in the back. Daria Kendall, the social worker, looked more polished than ever. Hair pulled tight, suit crisp. Her expression remained calm, composed, but the corners of her eyes betrayed discomfort. She hadn't expected an audience. Judge Colton raised an eyebrow as the cameras clicked. "This is not a press hearing," he said. "The public has a right to witness a case that could affect vulnerable populations statewide," Eva replied. "We're not just fighting for one woman, we're fighting for precedent." Colton reluctantly allowed the cameras to remain. Daria made her case quickly. "Mrs. Harper remains a danger to herself. While her cat has reappeared, her response to its loss, including reports of wandering her neighborhood screaming at night, demonstrates erratic behavior. Furthermore, she has no family support structure. This is not about cruelty. It's about ensuring safety." Eva rose slowly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, what we're witnessing is not care, it's discrimination. My client is not a danger to herself. She is a woman who found a way to survive profound grief and isolation, and she has documentation to prove that her relationship with her cat is therapeutic, not delusional." Dr. Shaw was called. She presented the video. The courtroom watched in silence as Willa, fragile and sunken, slowly came back to life over the course of a session, her breathing deepening, her voice returning, all with Midnight's constant presence anchoring her. The cardiologist's letter followed, confirming that the cat had consistently responded to changes in Willa's breathing patterns, sometimes alerting her hours before medical symptoms became obvious. When Eva finished, the courtroom was completely silent. Then Judge Colton cleared his throat. "While the court does not typically rule based on emotion, I must admit this is compelling." He turned to Willa. "Still, you live alone, no children, no emergency contacts. Why should the court not consider you a risk?" Willa stood. Her voice was calm. "Because living alone doesn't mean I'm broken, and loving an animal doesn't mean I'm mad. That cat saved my life. More than once. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just stayed. And that's more than I can say for most people." There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the crowd. Judge Colton paused. "We will adjourn for deliberation." Everyone stood. As Willa stepped outside the courtroom, she held Midnight close. Cameras snapped. A reporter asked her, "Do you think you'll win?" Willa turned, the afternoon sun painting her face with soft light. "I already did," she said, "because he came home." The court resumed 2 days later. This time, the atmosphere felt different. The gallery was full again, not just reporters, but citizens. Some held small hand-lettered signs, "Let Willa live, support seniors, not silence," and even one that read, "Midnight is her medicine." Willa had never seen anything like it. In all her quiet years of grieving and surviving, no one had ever stood beside her like this. But now the world had seen her video clips of Midnight placing his paw gently on her chest, nuzzling her cheek when she could barely sit upright. The footage had gone viral online, titled simply, "That cat is why she didn't go to a psychiatric hospital." Suddenly, Willa Harper had become more than just another elderly woman in legal trouble. She was a symbol of independence, of misjudged grief, of how the system treats those who don't fit into its prefabricated categories. In court, Eva sharpened her argument. "Your Honor, we are not just discussing mental competency. We are debating whether emotional connection is allowed to look different in older adults. Whether grief, when it does not conform to clinical timelines, is pathologized. Whether an elderly widow talking to her cat is more dangerous than the loneliness we so often leave them in." She introduced 2 expert witnesses. One, a geriatric psychiatrist from the University Hospital, testified that Willa displayed no signs of psychosis, dementia, or cognitive impairment. He'd reviewed the evaluation Dr. Neiman conducted and stated that grief language and pet bonding are not clinical red flags, they're human. The second expert, a veterinary behavioralist, testified that Midnight's responses were consistent with trained medical support animals, though he'd never been formally trained. "I've seen trained therapy cats," she said. "Midnight does things I've only seen in animals specifically trained to monitor human health." Then, just before closing arguments, Eva made one final move. She called a surprise witness, a postal worker named Darrell Johnson, who had delivered mail to Willa's neighborhood for over 10 years. He was a quiet man with a pressed shirt and soft eyes. "I don't talk much," he began, "but I seen her every week, rain or shine, talking to that cat, sure, but also taking out her trash, shoveling her walkway in the winter, picking up groceries on her own. If that lady's crazy, then we might all be better off being a little more like her." Laughter spread gently across the room. Even Judge Colton smirked before regaining his composure. The tide had shifted. The narrative that once cast Willa as fragile and delusional was now under fire. The crowd outside grew by the day. Thousands had signed an online petition demanding Willa's case be dismissed. Twitter threads were ablaze with stories from people who'd survived loss thanks to their pets. Hashtags spread like wildfire, "Free Willa, Midnight Matters, let them live." As Eva stood to deliver her final words, she turned to the judge. "You asked my client, why should the court not consider you a risk?" I asked the court. In return, what risk do we take when we remove a person from their only source of healing? When we criminalize their solitude? When we institutionalize their survival strategy? Judge Colton did not respond immediately, but Willa saw something in his eyes that had never been there before. Doubt. Understanding. Maybe even guilt. When the gavel came down to signal recess for final deliberation, Willa sat back in her chair. Midnight once again in her lap, now formally registered as an emotional support animal, thanks to fast-tracked documentation filed by Eva the night before. He blinked slowly and rubbed his cheek against her arm. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not because the battle was over, but because for the first time in a long time, she was no longer fighting it alone. The next morning, the courtroom was quiet, almost reverent. The chatter of reporters had dulled into solemn focus. Everyone knew something important was about to happen. Judge Colton returned to the bench, his usual stiff posture slackened ever so slightly. He cleared his throat, scanned the room, and looked directly at Willa. "This court has reviewed extensive testimony, medical documentation, expert analysis, and public concern," he began. "And while I stand by the need to intervene in truly at-risk cases, I must also acknowledge the harm that can come from acting on assumptions rather than facts." He paused, his eyes landing on Daria Kendall, the social worker. "It is the conclusion of this court that Mrs. Willa Harper is not a danger to herself or others. She displays no signs of psychiatric illness, cognitive impairment, or instability. On the contrary, her relationship with her animal demonstrates emotional resilience, not delusion." A hum of approval filled the room. But Colton wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on evidence presented during this hearing, the court recommends an internal review of the Department of Human Services, specifically the actions of Ms. Daria Kendall, for potential age-based bias and abuse of authority. Daria's face froze. She opened her mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand. "This is not your floor, Ms. Kendall." Then he turned to Eva. "Mrs. Harper's rights will be restored in full. The court also recognizes Midnight as a medically necessary emotional support animal registered and protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A murmur of disbelief ran through the gallery. No one expected that. Willa pressed her lips together, her eyes stinging. Midnight stirred in her lap, sensing the shift in energy, his body pressing close. And then came the final moment, one no one had predicted. A woman stood in the back, thin, gray-haired, with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking. "I'm her neighbor. I was one of the people who called the hotline. I thought I was helping. I didn't understand. But now I do. I'm sorry, Willa." Another person stood, then another. One by one, voices rose not to accuse but to apologize, to acknowledge their silence, their ignorance. The court had done more than restore Willa's freedom. It had cracked open something deeper. Truth had arrived. Not cleanly, not heroically, but undeniably. The ruling was handed down. Willa Harper was free. Free to return to her home, free to walk her own halls without suspicion, free to hold her cat without having to justify it to the state. But the weight of the battle lingered. The day after the court victory, Willa stood in her backyard, trimming the hedges beneath the soft morning sun. Midnight followed her, in measured steps, brushing against her legs with his tail like he was checking her pulse with every pass. There were no reporters now. No crowds or applause, just silence, and the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from age, but from being disbelieved. She had won the case, but not without scars. For weeks after the hearing, she would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, her mind reaching out for Midnight. Terrified he had been taken again. Even as he purred against her chest, her hands trembled. She'd been publicly humiliated. Her dignity questioned, her sanity debated like it was an item in probate court. No one had reimbursed her for the damage to her reputation, her sleepless nights, or the ache of those hours when she thought Midnight was lost forever. The apology from her neighbors was brief, a pie left on her porch, a scribbled note. But no words could undo the fear of being caged. Ava called often, offering to help her file a civil suit. "We can make them pay," she said. "You'd have the public behind you." But Willa hesitated, not out of forgiveness, but from exhaustion. "I didn't fight for money," she replied. "I fought for my right to grieve the way I needed to heal with what I had left." That night, she sat on the porch steps with Midnight curled beside her, watching the stars blink into the sky one by one. Her bones ached, her spirit worn thin. But she was still home, still herself, still alive. And in the quiet, she made a decision. She wouldn't go back to courtrooms, wouldn't seek more press, but neither would she disappear. She would speak, but on her own terms, in her own way. To the lonely widow down the street who was being pressured into assisted living. To the young black man whose grandmother talked to her dog and was almost committed. To anyone they tried to silence with a clipboard and a diagnosis. She hadn't survived to sit quietly. No, Willa Harper was tired. But she was not done. The story of Willa Harper didn't end in the courtroom. It echoed. Within a week of the ruling, advocacy groups picked up her case. The National Alliance for Elder Justice launched a formal investigation into how psychiatric holds were being used often as tools of convenience, especially against the elderly poor or those without immediate family. The investigation revealed over 300 similar cases in the state alone where older adults had been forced into evaluations based on nothing more than neighbor reports or misunderstandings about grief memory or companionship. The backlash was swift. A new policy was enacted. Statewide elder psychiatric evaluations now required at least 2 corroborating sources, one of them medical. No more anonymous tips used as weapons. No more surprise detainments. Daria Kendall, the social worker who initiated Willa's evaluation, was placed under formal review. Internal emails surfaced, revealing troubling language references to cleaning up the street and removing liabilities from the community. She was suspended pending a discrimination and ethics hearing. Willa never gloated. But she read the article aloud to Midnight, who purred in approval as he sat perched on the windowsill. Elsewhere, something beautiful bloomed. Support groups began forming around the country, led by volunteers who had once felt too small to resist the system. They called themselves the Midnight Circle, people who had survived trauma with the help of animals, and now advocated for laws recognizing emotional support companions as legitimate medical resources. Eva, who had taken Willa's case with little expectation of winning, became a recognized voice in elder rights law. She appeared on panels, gave interviews, and helped draft new legislative guidelines to prevent future abuses. As for Willa, she turned down most interviews. But she did agree to one feature for a small independent podcast. It was just her sitting on her porch with Midnight. In her lap, her voice calm, clear, and rooted like old trees. They said I was broken, she said, but it was the world that forgot how to see people like me as whole. Grief doesn't vanish because we get older, and love doesn't become invalid just because it doesn't come from another person. The episode went viral. Schools used it in ethics discussions. Law classes studied her case. Pet therapy programs received renewed funding. Veterinary clinics reported a rise in emotional support certifications. One spring afternoon, a small delegation from the local council visited Willa's home. They brought flowers and a plaque. Midnight Harper, it read, certified medical support animal, for his role in saving a life and changing the law. Willa placed it above the fireplace beside Aaron's folded flag, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Not perfect, not without wounds, but peace. Willa Harper didn't become a celebrity. She didn't need to. Her name lived in city council proposals, state policy revisions, and in the voices of people who finally had the language and courage to say, this isn't just grief. This is survival. This is care. Willa kept to herself in the years that followed. She tended her garden, kept up her routines, but now neighbors waved when she passed. A few knocked, asking if she'd sit with their grandmothers who were going through similar things, and Willa did every time. Sometimes she just listened. Sometimes she brought Midnight, who would curl up at the feet of strangers and do what he had always done, anchor someone gently back to the world. Children who used to call her the weird cat lady now called her Miss Willa. Their parents taught them that love looks different for everyone, that healing doesn't always sound like silence. Sometimes it sounds like soft conversation with a creature who never judges you, and sometimes it sounds like fighting back when no one expects you to. Willa's story entered classrooms, city meetings, and dinner tables. It made people pause before calling a hotline on a lonely elder. It made cities rethink how they define support. But more than that, it inspired something deeper, a challenge. To recognize those living quietly not as weak but as witnesses, as survivors, as people whose stories matter even if they don't fit the mold. Because Willa's legacy wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't even the policy she helped change. Her legacy was belief in herself and in a creature no one else had seen as a lifeline. In her final podcast interview, Willa said it simply, "You don't have to be loud to take up space, you just have to refuse to be erased." That line became a rallying cry, painted on murals, quoted in speeches, shared in thousands of posts across social media. It resonated not just with elders, but with anyone who had ever been silenced. So now we ask you, the listener, the reader, what will you do after knowing this story? Will you check in on your neighbors? Will you advocate for better laws to protect the vulnerable? Will you speak when silence becomes dangerous? Or maybe, just maybe, you'll reach down, scratch behind the ears of the animal that's been keeping you going and say thank you. Because sometimes healing doesn't look like a hospital. Sometimes it looks like an old woman on her porch, a black cat in her lap, and the quiet knowledge that she mattered, that she fought, and that she won. If this story moved, you share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe to the Black Women channel and help us shine a light on the untold, the overlooked, and the unbroken. We tell these stories because they matter. Because you matter. Because someone somewhere is still fighting to be heard.